Okay. Okay. So we are picking back up at Leviticus chapter 16, um, beginning with verse 23. Let me get somebody to read from verse 23 to 29.
Then Aaron shall come into the tabernacle of testimony and take off the linen garments he put on when he went into the holy place, and he shall leave them there. He shall then wash his body with water in a holy place, put on his garments, and come out to offer his whole burnt offering, and make the whole burnt offering of the people, to make atonement for himself, his house, the people, and in matters concerning the priests. The fat of the sin offering he shall offer on the altar. He who sent away the kid, which was set apart for remission, shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward he may come into the camp. The young bull and the kid for the sin offerings, whose blood was brought in to make atonement in the holy place, shall be carried outside the camp, and they shall burn them in the fire. Their skin, their flesh, and their offal. Then he who burns them shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterwards he may come into the camp.
Go ahead and read the next verse, 29.
This shall be an ordinance forever for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall humble your souls, and do no work at all, whether a native of your own country or a resident alien who dwells among you.
Okay. So this is still talking about the Day of Atonement, and they're referencing the offering of the two goats, one which is sacrifice and one is the scapegoat. And we talked about that the last time in more detail. One thing that I came across more recently is that the epistle of Barnabas, which is it's not in the New Testament, but it's considered to be among the apostolic fathers' writings generally, has a section where he talks about the symbolism of the scapegoat, and we actually covered that essentially. But he pointed out a few things, like the goat that was marked for being the one that would be sent out of the camp. They put a scarlet ribbon or something like that, or cloth on one of his horns, and they would drive him out of the camp with people. The Jewish custom at that time was to spit on the scapegoat to drive him out of the camp, and to hit it with sticks, and to get it to leave. And so he makes a connection between the way that Christ was treated and the scarlet or the purple cloth that was put in the horn. He connects that with the purple robe that was put on Christ, and so there's a lot of interesting parallels there. But talking about the solemnity of the fast, Saint Caesarius of Arles says, he's quoting from the passage, "On the days of your solemn feasts, you shall mortify yourself." And what does he say? He says, "Why do you say this? Because fast and vigils and holy mortifications afflict bodies that are humbled, but they purify hearts that have been defiled. They may take strength away from limbs, but they add a bright sheen to conscience. Sins of pleasure are redeemed by bodily weakness, while the physical delights of dissipation are punished by the distress of a hard cross. Thus they present mortification. Thus by present mortification, the sentence of future death is suspended." And so this was the most ancient annual fast that the Jews had. There were several others that were added later in Jewish observance, but this was the earliest one. And one of the interesting things about it is that the Day of Atonement happens in September, right around the same time that we have the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. which is probably not coincidental. Let me get somebody to read verses 30 through 34.
For on that day the priest shall make atonement for you to cleanse you from all your sins before the Lord. Thus you shall be clean. It is the Sabbath of Sabbaths, a rest for you, and you shall humble your souls. It is an ordinance forever. So the priest who is anointed and consecrated to minister as priest in his father's place shall make atonement and put on the linen clothes and the holy garments. Then he shall make atonement in the most holy place, the tabernacle of testimony, and the altar. And he shall make atonement for matters concerning the priests and all the congregation. So this shall be an ordinance forever for you, to make atonement for the children of Israel for all their sins. And he shall do this once a year, as the Lord gave orders to Moses.
In terms of fasting, if you look at Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19, it talks about there being 4 fasts. And these are fasts that were added later, but they were observed in his time. And it's interesting that we have 4 major fast periods in the church today. But there was the fast of the 4th month, which was marking, it was in mourning over the breach of the walls of Jerusalem. And then there was the fast of the 5th month, which and the first one was July the 17th, roughly. The second one was the destruction of the temple, which was around August the 3rd. And then there was the fast of the 7th month, which also it falls in the same month as Yom Kippur, which with the Day of Atonement. So right around in September. And then you had the fast of the 10th month, which was around December the 30th, commemorating the final siege of Jerusalem. And so fasting's always been something that Jews did. So by the time of Christ, this was a regular thing. And also the Jewish practice of fasting on, I believe it was, maybe it was Tuesday and Thursday, was a regular fast that pious Jews observed. And so Christians adopted something similar, but they moved them to Wednesday and Friday in commemoration of the betrayal of Christ on Wednesday, and then the crucifixion on the on Friday. Let me get somebody to read verse. Let's go on to chapter 17. Any questions about that, though, before we move on? Okay, chapter 17. Go ahead, William.
I had a quick question. So a lot of times I feel like you'll see certain groups point out the injunction that this is an ordinance forever, to try to, as some sort of like an apologetic for why Christians don't actually follow the Sabbath or something like that. What, I guess, would be our response for that sort of objection?
Well, when you talk about, I'm trying to remember the wording in the Constitution, but the Constitution, actually, maybe it's the Articles of Confederation, but one of these documents has language about the Articles or the Constitution being perpetual. But what that means is that it was in force until otherwise amended. In other words, the Articles of Confederation were eventually done away with, even though it was a perpetual union. And so yeah, and it was the Articles of Confederation that used this, because I know people in the Constitution, it talks about in order to form a more perfect union. So some people try to use the argument that, well, if that first one was perpetual and this is more perfect, that means that it has to be unchangeable. But if the first one was changeable, the second one obviously wasn't changeable either. But the point being that when you talk about something being perpetual, it just means that it's in force, going forward. It doesn't necessarily mean that there could be nothing that could change that. But in some sense, you could say that we still have all these things that are fulfilled in the New Testament, and we just have them observed in different ways in the New Testament. So, for example, when it comes to the Sabbath, we still observe the Sabbath. And we do that in two ways. One is Saturday is still the old Sabbath. And that's the reason why during Great Lent, we always, at least can do liturgies on Saturday and Sunday, even though we can only do the pre-sanctified liturgy on the weekdays of Lent unless Annunciation falls on one of those days. So we still mark Saturday as a important day, but Sunday is the new Sabbath because it's marking something greater than the creation of the world. It's marking the resurrection of Christ. So I think that's how that's what we would say, is that on one level we do still observe these things, but we just observe them in a different way because there's a new reality. Chapter 17, in some sense, you could say that it's giving some more commentary that's connected with what we just read, the Day of Atonement. But it also, some people see it as beginning what's known as the Holiness Code, which goes to chapter 20. And so it's kind of, but it's really not quite like what most of the Holiness Code is. So I think that it's clearly the Holiness Code begins at least by chapter 18, but chapter 17 is really talking about observing ordinances related to sacrifices. And so it's, like I said, connected to the sacrifices that we've just talked about, but it's arguably connected with the entirety of the moral law that's laid out that we'll be getting into certainly in chapter 18. Let me get somebody to read verses 1 through 9.
Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron, his sons, and all the children of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing that the Lord commanded, saying, Whatever man of the children of Israel or resident aliens dwelling among them kills a young bull, a sheep, or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of the testimony, to offer it as a whole burnt offering or a peace offering to the Lord, acceptable for a sweet aroma. And whatever man kills outside and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of testimony, so as to offer it as a gift to the Lord, before the Lord's tabernacle, blood shall be reckoned to that man, for he has shed blood. And that man shall be utterly destroyed from among his people, that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices they kill in the fields to the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of testimony to the priest, and offer them as peace offerings to the Lord. The priest shall pour the blood upon the altar all around before the Lord at the doors of the tabernacle of testimony, and offer the fat for a sweet aroma to the Lord. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to worthless things, after whom they prostituted themselves. This shall be an ordinance forever for you throughout your generations. Also you shall say to them, Whatever man of the children of Israel, or of the resident aliens who dwell among you, offers whole burnt offering or sacrifice, and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of testimony to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be utterly destroyed from among his people.
So one thing that I would point out is that when it's talking in that translation, it says utterly destroyed. The Hebrew word is cut off from the people. And from the context that phrase is used, it doesn't seem to be the case that this meant that people were taken out and stoned to death or anything like that. But it probably meant something a lot more like what we would say, we call it excommunication. So someone would no longer be allowed to participate in the worship until they repented. And and if if they did something that no one ever found out about, the idea was that you have God's judgment to face, and so God's going to be the one that you're going to have to answer to. So this would have been something that would have been taken very seriously by people who believed in God and believed that a God who was all powerful and everywhere present could certainly enforce. And so it would have been something that would have caused people to think twice before they did it. Now, the big question you might ask is, why is it that anytime you would slay any of these animals, that the law is saying that that had to be done at the tabernacle? And I should note that when you get into Deuteronomy, when Moses is telling people what to do when they get into the land, obviously in the wilderness, they were all camped around the tabernacle. And so at the time that Moses gave this ordinance, it would have been possible for people to have all done that. But when they entered into the land, people who lived miles and miles away from the temple or the tabernacle wouldn't have been able to do that. So basically, they would have had to just not slay, used animals like cattle or sheep or goats for food. And what Deuteronomy says is, if you're far away from the temple or the tabernacle, you don't have to do that, but you still can't drink the blood. You still have to dispose of the blood in the proper way. But if you were within a reasonable distance of the temple or the tabernacle, that you had to still observe this. But Blessed Theodore explains what the issue was here. He says, why did he forbid that animals raised for their flesh be slaughtered away from the tabernacle? He was aware that some people were idolaters and knew that they would offer sacrifices to demons. So he ordered anyone who wished to slay a calf, sheep, or goat to bring them to the doors of the tabernacle, pour out the blood, and consume the meat at home. Whoever did not do this was to be regarded as guilty of murder. That person will be considered guilty of bloodshed. He has shed blood, and his soul should be cut off from his people. The following passage confirms that the law had this purpose. Had the purpose I have alleged, and he quotes, the priest will offer the fat as a sweet-smelling sacrifice to the Lord. They will no longer offer their sacrifices to empty things, to the empty things to which they have prostituted themselves. It will be an everlasting law for your generation. This law is in force among the Jews to the present day. The priests slaughter the animals that are to be eaten. Any questions about that before we move on to the next section, which talks about eating blood?
With that type of penalty, you'd think that they would have adhered to it a little more in the Old Testament.
Well, you would think so, but I mean, the penalty cut off from the people. Like I said, it wasn't that people were taken out and stoned, although if people were found to actually offer sacrifice to another deity, they would have been stoned.
Yeah. But I mean, it even reached the kings. Quite a few of them would do the same thing.
Right.
Yeah. So it's just kind of mind-boggling.
Well, it was a regular problem, and that's why the law was so strict about it, because had there not been a law like this, it's almost certainly the case that some people would have been offering sacrifices to pagan deities.
Absolutely, yeah. I wonder if they had actually fulfilled God's commands in taking out all the idolatrous peoples that were there before, that if this would have been as big of a problem.
Well, it certainly wouldn't have been. And the scriptures later on say that the fact that they didn't do that caused these people to be a snare to them.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a continuous problem throughout the Old Testament. It seems to be continuing in the New Testament also.
Well, in the New Testament period, at least, yes.
Not with the
right.
people of God. Okay.
Right.
Sorry. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, let me get somebody to read verses 10 and 11.
And whatever man of the children of Israel or of the resident aliens dwelling among you eats any blood, I will set my face against that soul who eats blood, and will utterly destroy him from among his people. For the life of all flesh is in its blood, and I give it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For its blood makes atonement for the soul.
So here's what St. John Chrysostom says about this. He says, in the case of the human person, first its body is created from dust, and afterwards the power of life is given to it. This is the being of the soul. Accordingly, Moses said about the beast, its blood is its life. But in the case of the human person, its being is incorporeal and immortal, and has a great superiority over the body, to the same extent as incorporeal form surpasses the corporeal. So he's saying that our life is more than just blood, although it's certainly the case that our blood is what gives us, our bodies get oxygen, our bodies get nourishment. Without blood, we die, and we all know that to be the case. If you shed blood, you're taking somebody's life, and we'll talk about this more, but it's not by mere chance that the blood of Christ is the means by which we're saved. Matthew?
Hello, Father. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
Yeah, I've wondered about this often in China because I early on was eating duck blood soup, didn't know what it was, just looked like tofu because it's kind of boiled and congealed. So and then later someone said, yeah, you're not supposed to eat that. So that's the case now?
Right.
I mean, obviously not during Lent, of course, but I mean generally.
And we're not allowed to eat blood anytime.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and read the next section, and then we'll talk about that in more detail. Let me get somebody to read verses 12 through 16.
Therefore I said to the children of Israel, no one among you shall eat blood, nor shall any resident alien who dwells among you eat blood. Whatever man of the children of Israel, or of the resident aliens dwelling among you, hunts and catches any animal or bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with dirt. For the life of all flesh is its blood. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, you shall not eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be utterly destroyed. Every soul who eats what died naturally or what was torn by wild animals, whether a native of your own country or a resident alien, he shall both wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. Then he shall be clean. But if he does not both wash his body and bathe in water, he shall bear his guilt.
Okay, so here it's just saying that what goes for the blood of these animals that are normally sacrificial animals goes for animals that you might kill by hunting. It's just you obviously couldn't chase a deer into the tabernacle and have it and have it killed there, and those kinds of animals were never appointed to be sacrificial animals in any case, but you still couldn't eat the blood. So you'll often, Acts chapter 15, the big question that the first church council dealt with was, what are we to do with these Gentile converts? Because you had people who were converts from the Pharisees that were saying, well, they've got to become Jews and keep the law. And it's not an unreasonable thing for them to assume, because that's what they've known as being their faith all their lives. And so the idea that people could be in the church and yet not be Jews, at least convert Jews, was something that they had a hard time with. But, you had the testimony of St. Peter and the testimony of St. Paul talking about their interaction with the Gentiles. The vision of St. Peter played a very big role in this decision. And then the council made a decision, and they only imposed certain basic things among the Gentiles. Basically, they were not to engage in things like fornication, idolatry, but among the things that are listed that they're not supposed to do, that Gentiles, even though they don't have to become Jews, they don't have to keep the kosher laws, they don't have to do all these other things that Jews do, but among the things that is listed is that they cannot eat blood. And if you listen to Protestant commentators, you will almost, if not absolutely universally, be told, well, that was just for that time. that this was only a temporary thing because maybe the apostles were trying to keep Gentiles from offending Jews by eating blood, and but that this was not something that was intended for Christians to observe going forward. As a matter of fact, I was reading a pretty good Protestant commentary on this on Leviticus that said, and this, the idea that Christians shouldn't eat blood is something that Christians observed up until the time of Tertullian. So we're talking about 2nd century. And he made no reference to the fact that it's always been the church's teaching that you can't eat blood. We actually have at least two canons from the that these are not, well, one of these is an ecumenical council, but they're all considered to be of ecumenical weight. But the first one is Canon 63 of the Holy Apostles. And the canons of the Holy Apostles, they were not, produced by an ecumenical council. But the tradition of the church says that these really are apostolic teachings. Not necessarily that the apostles themselves wrote them down, but that people who knew the apostles wrote these things down because this was what the apostles taught. And so Canon 63 says, if any bishop or presbyter or deacon or anyone else on the sacerdotal list at all eat meat in the blood of its soul, or that has been killed by a wild beast, or that has died a natural death, let him be deposed. For the law has forbidden this. But if any layman do the same, let him be excommunicated. And then we have the interpretation from Saint Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, and this is what he says: because of the fact that even God, in giving the law about what could be consumed in Noah, said to him, every moving thing that liveth shall be food for you. Even like the green herb have I given you all things, but meat in the blood of its soul shall ye not eat. And that's referring to Genesis chapter 9, verses 3 and 4. So this was what God commanded Noah before the law of Moses came. And I think that when the apostles came up with their list of things that Gentiles were expected to observe, almost certainly had this passage in mind, that this was not just the Israelites who were commanded to do this, but all human beings were commanded to do this after the flood. And so he just goes on basically to talk about how this is, an ongoing thing that we're supposed to observe. There's quite a bit more that you can read about this in the Rudder. He quotes different fathers that talk about this, but probably we don't need to get into too much detail about it. But the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Canon 67, says, divine scripture has commanded us to abstain from blood and strangled flesh and fornication. And the editor of the translation references the passage in Genesis, Leviticus chapter 17, which we just read, and then chapter 18, verse 13 of Leviticus, and then also quotes the passage or references the passage in the Acts of the Apostles. We therefore suitably penance those who, on account of their dainty stomach, eat the blood of any animal after they have rendered it eatable by some art. If therefore anyone from now on should attempt to eat the blood of any animal in any way whatsoever, if he be a clergyman, let him be deposed from office, but if he be a layman, let him be excommunicated. So this is definitely still the teaching of the church. And so that means that, blood sausage or something like that, these are things that we're not supposed to be eating. It does not mean that if you have a rare steak and you see juice coming out of it, that is a violation of this commandment, because what you're seeing coming out of the steak at that point is not blood. That's just there's moisture still in meat when you cook it. So basically, you drain the blood out of the animal, and then you carve it up and eat it. Any questions about that before we move on to chapter 18?
I had a quick question just about, I guess, what it means that the life of all flesh is in its blood. Like, what does that mean in the most plain sense?
Well, blood has special significance, and it really is the means by which every animal stays alive. If blood stops flowing, that means they're dead. If you drain blood out of some living animal, it's going to die very quickly. So the life really is in the blood in a very literal sense. But you could say, well, you can't live without a lot of things. You can't live without your heart. So why is this focus on blood? But I think it's because of the fact that God already in his divine providence knew that Christ would die on the cross for us, and that his blood would be shed for our sins, and that we would be partaking of that in the form of the Eucharist. And so he was teaching people to abstain from any other kind of blood in anticipation of the day that we would be able to partake of the blood by which we get not just life in a purely biological sense, but which we get spiritual life and attain eternal life. Any other questions? Okay. So now we're going to get into chapter 18. And this section has a whole lot of stuff about unlawful sexual relations, but it begins with a preface. So let's read the preface first. It's verses 1 through 5.
Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. According to the way of life in the land of Egypt, where you dwelt, you shall not do. And according to the way of life in the land of Canaan, where I bring you, you shall not do. Nor shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall do my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep all my ordinances and my judgments and do these, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord your God.
Okay, so basically, the Israelites are in the wilderness. They've left Egypt. They're about to go into the land of Canaan. And he's saying, don't do like the people back in Egypt did, and don't do like the people in Canaan are doing, because that's the reason why God's punishment was poured out on these people. And so here we're talking about a moral law that all nations were required to observe. I have an article on my blog about it. The title of it is Shrimp and Homosexuality, because you will often hear people say, well, if you're going to say because Leviticus says you can't be a homosexual and say that that's still binding, why are you still eating shrimp? Because it also says that shrimp is not allowable. As a matter of fact, in most English translations, it talks about homosexuality being an abomination, and that it says that shrimp is an abomination. So why are you being selective? Well, the thing is the word in Hebrew that's translated as abomination in reference to homosexuality is an entirely different word than the word that's referring to shrimp as being an abomination. A better translation, I think, is detestable in relation to shrimp, but basically, nothing that's referred to as being detestable ever resulted in the death penalty. But homosexuality was something for which you would be put to death in Israelite culture. So we're not talking about the same kind of thing, but that's the kind of thing that you often hear pro-homosexual apologists try to argue. But the other thing is, God didn't judge the nations because they were eating shrimp. God didn't say, I poured out my wrath on Egypt because they were eating shrimp, and I'm getting ready to have you displace the people of Canaan because they're eating shrimp. That was not the case. And so non-Jews were never expected to abide by the kosher laws, but they were expected to not engage in immorality, which had already been revealed to the human race, at the time of the flood, that these things were not allowable. These things were things that the wrath of God would be poured out upon you if you engage in these things. Let me give you a couple quotes from the fathers on this. St. Augustine says, "The righteousness of the law, of which it is said that if a man does it, he shall live in it, is set forth to this end, that every man may recognize his own infirmity. It is not his own strength or through the letter of the law, which cannot be, but only by receiving through faith the favor of the justifier, that he may attain and do and live in righteousness." St. Jerome says, "The man who carries out the law will find life through it. Scripture did not say he will find life, did not say that he will find life through it, in the sense that through the law he will live in heaven, but he will find life through it to the extent that what he merits he reaps in the present world." And then St. John Cassian says, "The law promises those who practice it not the rewards of heavenly kingdoms, but the consolations of this life, when it says, the one who does these things shall live by them. But the Lord says to his disciples, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now let's read verses 16 through 18, and then we'll talk about these in more detail.
Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter. Neither shalt thou take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. For they are her.
I think I gave you the wrong beginning. Did I say verse 6 or?
You said 16.
But yeah, begin at verse 6.
Okay.
And then go to 18.
Okay, sure. None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of thy father or the nakedness of thy mother shalt thou not uncover. She is thy mother. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness. The nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father, or daughter of thy mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover. The nakedness of thy son's daughter or of thy daughter's daughter, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover, for theirs is thine own nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife's daughter, begotten of thy father, she is thy sister, thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's sister, she is thy father's near kinswoman. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy mother's sister, for she is thy mother's near kinswoman. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's brother. Thou shalt not approach to his wife. She is thine aunt. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy daughter-in-law. She is thy son's wife. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter, neither shalt thou take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness, for they are her near kinswomen. It is wickedness. Neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister, to vex her, to uncover her nakedness, beside the other in her lifetime.
So there's a lot there. Now, when it talks about uncovering the nakedness, it's talking about sexual relations ultimately. Although it also uses the phrase in sort of a more figurative sense when it talks about like you couldn't marry your father's wife even if that was not your mother, which is this is what happened in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Where you had a man that was living with his basically stepmother, and almost certainly his father had died. And a scenario that I think is likely in that case was that you probably had an older man that was married to a younger woman. And again, this is not the mother of the man in question, but his father dies and he winds up in a romantic relationship with this woman. And why is that wrong? Well, what this is saying is that because that woman became one flesh with this man's father, he's now uncovering his father's nakedness by having this relationship with this woman. So obviously he's not having relations with his father in the most literal sense of that, but that's the way the language is being used here. So you could I mean, one thing you should keep in mind is the fact that when this passage is talking about all these things, it's not like people weren't doing these things. You might say, well, duh, of course you wouldn't. Who would want to do that? Well, in Egypt, the pharaohs routinely married their sisters, and you had pharaohs that married their daughters. So they just came from a country where this kind of stuff was happening on the national stage on a regular basis. And in the church, and this is, you could probably work out what degrees of relationship this comes out to. I'm not sure if it actually matches up with the 7 degrees of separation that we require in the church or not, but it's probably pretty close to it if it's not. But in the church, we say that for you to marry someone, there has to be 7 degrees of separation at a minimum. And that's blood relations. If it's a spiritual relationship, and here we're talking about godparent, godchild relationships, it requires 3 degrees of separation. So how do these degrees work? Well, I am 1 degree separated from my parents. And then my siblings are the same degree, obviously connected to my parents. So that means my relationship with them is 2 degrees. And so if I had a sister, I obviously couldn't marry her because that would only be 2 degrees of separation. And if my siblings had a child, that would add 1 more degree to that relationship, but it would still not be anywhere as close to 7 degrees of relationship. So does everybody understand what I'm saying? This is how this works. It sounds super complicated, but I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. And so this also extends to relationships by marriage. So if I marry a woman and she has a sister, that means my brother cannot then, if we're all Orthodox Christians and we're abiding by the traditions of the church, that means my brother could not marry my sister. Or if my wife died, I could not later marry my sister-in-law, because now I have this close relationship by marriage with this woman that even though it's not a blood relationship directly, because I become one flesh with my wife. And by the way, your relationship with your spouse is a 0 degree relationship. In other words, you are not separated at all from your spouse as far as the teachings of the church. So that means I have the same relationships that my wife has, which is why we talk about, my mother-in-law. She's my mother. We add the phrase "in law" to distinguish them from biological parents. But spiritually, as far as the eyes of the church are concerned, I'm as related to my mother-in-law as I am to my own mother, and I have the same obligations to her that I have to my own mother. Now there is one workaround with the two siblings wanting to marry two siblings, and that's if they both get married in the same service. I knew a guy. I knew of a situation, let's say, where you had two brothers that were both dating two sisters. And they all understood this because actually in both cases, their parents were priests. So they all understood that this was an issue. And there was one couple was ready to pull the trigger and get married, and the other one was kind of vacillating. And then finally they decided that, actually the woman in this case decided that she didn't want to go through with it. So they didn't do a double wedding. And basically that closed the book on that whole question after that, because now they're related. But if they had gotten married at the same time, that would not have violated this tradition of the church. Any questions about that before we move on?
I have a quick question from I guess I imagine that whatever, like traditions or canons that the church has, there's some practical, I guess, like reason for it. In the case of like a brother and a sister and a brother and a sister, like the pair you were just talking about, what I guess there would be maybe the danger of something like that, or what would be like the reason for that like ruling?
The issue, it's not, I mean, we could talk about, we understand that there are genetic problems with incest and stuff like that. But the thing is that when you have a intimate family relationship, like if I marry into a family and now I'm treating my wife's siblings as my own siblings, to then start to confuse that by bringing in other romantic relationships that are from close kin, you're possibly you want to talk about a negative effect that could result from that. Let's say I have a brother who starts dating my sister-in-law, and then it winds up becoming a horrible relationship or something like that. Well, now it could wind up causing division within this new family that I've married into. And so I think that's probably a big part of it, is that whole thing, is that now we're taking something that's a close relationship and we're mixing in some other things that ought not happen in that context. In our culture, we're so relaxed about these things that I don't think that we can appreciate it. But, you probably heard the phrase kissing cousin. Well, the reason why we have this phrase, which I don't think most people know what it even means anymore. We kind of know because we have expressions. Like we'll say that, we might figuratively say that something's a kissing cousin, like the Church of the Nazarene is kissing cousins with the Free Methodist Church, you could say. But a kissing cousin is a cousin that's close enough related to where you could kiss them in public without it causing a scandal. So in our culture, we don't care about that anymore. That most people don't bat an eye if they see people kissing in public. It's just not something that people think anything about. But in a culture that was more reserved and probably more healthy, if you're in the bonds of a close family relationship and you're giving someone a kiss, everyone knows, well, this is just a friendly, loving, familial kiss, and you don't have any romantic designs on it. So I think that's a big part of it. Mikey, you have a question?
Hi, Father John. So I know how you said that like siblings can marry sibling like two sets of siblings, whatever. But I grew up with this family that was identical twins, and then they married and identical like twins, and they were both boys, and then they married two sisters. And I always thought that that was super like weird. Like, do you think that that would be allowed in the church as well? Like if they got married on the same day, or would that be something completely totally different since they're twins?
There's no church rule against that. So if they got married at the same time, it wouldn't be forbidden.
Okay, interesting. Okay. I just thought
Yeah.
since like they're identical and they share the same DNA, I thought that that would be like a different like case.
Yeah, I don't think people in ancient times really even thought about it in those terms. I mean, they obviously knew that identical twins looked like each other, but they certainly weren't thinking about DNA.
Right, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay. All right, Jonathan.
Yeah, so I've heard about, like, especially in the Middle Ages, and this just could be like a Catholic thing, but like, like the French kings and some of the English kings, they all just married their own family to keep the bloodline pure. Is that just like a Catholic problem? I mean, this seems to be like this was pretty common knowledge that you weren't supposed to be doing this kind of thing.
I think that in the Catholic Church, I'm not sure if they at certain point decided they were going to blow off the 7 degrees of separation. I don't know that, but I do know that it was certainly in the West, these things were allowed. I mean, it was very common for people to marry second cousins and even first cousins in some cases, and obviously a first cousin would be someone that would not be allowable in the Orthodox tradition. And a second cousin, I don't believe so. I'd have to do the math on how many degrees of separation you'd get out of that. But I still think that would probably, unless it was like a first cousin once removed or something like that, I don't think that it would work in our tradition.
Yeah.
But if you want a good example of where you get into some problems with this, Henry VIII, he wound up starting a Protestant church and went into schism with the Roman Catholic Church because he wanted a divorce. And how did that marriage begin in the first place? Well, Catherine of Aragon was married to his older brother, and his older brother died. So by the laws of the church, they should not have allowed her to marry Henry VIII, but the Pope gave a dispensation.
Yeah.
So that's how that marriage happened.
Wow.
And then later on, Henry obviously was bothered by the fact that he wasn't having a male heir. If he'd had a male heir, he probably wouldn't have had scruples on this, but he actually started reading about this and at least convinced himself that God's curse was upon him because he had married his brother's wife. And so there's a case where it certainly did cause a lot of problems that these boundaries were not observed.
Yeah. Well, glad I'm not Catholic. Thank God.
Yeah, in the Catholic Church, there's a number of things that they blow off that are actually in the ecumenical canons. And one of them is that, in the Orthodox Church, the ideal is that when you get married, that you only get married once. It's not forbidden that you get married again under the right circumstances. So like if you're a man, you have a wife, and this happened a lot in times prior to modern medicine. You might have a wife, you might have several kids and then have a wife die in childbirth. It's allowable for a man in that case to get married again, but it's not the ideal. And so that man could not become a priest if he was married twice. But it would be allowable. And even a third marriage is allowable under extreme circumstances, but it's discouraged. And it doesn't matter. I mean, it could be the most innocent of reasons. You could eliminate the whole question of divorce and remarriage and just talk about someone who gets widowed repeatedly. And then they get married the third time. Well, in the Orthodox Church, it's 3 strikes, you're out. Basically, you get married. Yeah, the third marriage you have is the last one you're ever going to get in the church. In the Catholic Church, there's no limit.
Yikes.
So you could get married 5-6 times in the Catholic Church, and it would be allowable. And I don't understand why they blow that off, because it is talked about in the canons.
They don't call it divorce, they call it annulment. So they basically say the marriage never existed, correct?
Well, but the thing is, I'm talking about, even if you eliminate divorce from the scenario and you just talk about a guy who his wife dies in childbirth, and then he gets married again, and that wife dies in childbirth, and then he gets married again, and let's say she dies of the flu, well, he can't get married a fourth time in the Orthodox Church, and he didn't do anything wrong in any of those cases. He didn't, commit adultery. He didn't, you can't blame him for getting divorced. It's not his fault that his wife's died. But in the Orthodox Church, a fourth marriage is never allowable. And yet in the Catholic Church, he could get married 5-6 times if he wanted to. He could be like the woman in the song "I'm Henry VIII," where the woman marries an eighth Henry. Mikey.
So I understand that marriage is taken the most respected in the sense in the Orthodox Church, and I know that someone asked Jesus this once of who are they going to be married to, and I had heard that there is a different perspective of marriage after death in the Orthodox Church. Is there anything that you could speak on that about? Because if you're married 3 times, wouldn't that also make an issue?
Well, the whole point of the problem that the Sadducees presented Christ with was a woman who was married 7 times. And, obviously it was a exaggerated scenario that they were presenting them with, but, they were appealing to the Levirate laws that you have in the scriptures, that if a man dies and his wife, he doesn't have any children, then a kinsman is supposed to marry that woman and raise up a seed on behalf of his brother. And basically that child would not have been considered to be that brother's child. He would have been raising up children for his brother. So in this scenario, you've got this woman that's married 7 times, has no children, because I think they wanted to eliminate children from the scenario, so you couldn't say, well, I guess it'd be the one that he actually had a child with. And but Christ says, you err not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. God is not the God of the dead or the living. And because they rejected the idea of the afterlife, basically. And also he says that in heaven, we're like the angels. And so we're neither married nor given in marriage in heaven. That doesn't mean that you lose your, you're not, it doesn't mean that in heaven you don't have an awareness of your relationship, so that there's not some kind of continuation of a marriage or of a relationship between a man and a wife in heaven. But it does mean that it's not going to be like it is on earth. It's not going to be the way we think of as marriage. It's not going to be a fleshly union. And, but, we do have in the lives of the saints examples like St. Peter and Fabronia. This couple, we hold them up as a model of marriage. And it's a long story, and we're running out of time. But to make a long story short, they prayed that they would die on the same day, and they did. And then people tried to separate them at death, because there were people who didn't like the wife because she came from a peasant family, and they wanted to bury them separately. But 2 times it happened that while the bodies were in the church, when the next day when they came to church, they were in the same coffin. So they were, we speak of them as being together eternally in some sense. So I think that you don't want to think of marriage as being eternal in some kind of a romantic sense, but it doesn't mean that we'll have less of a intimate relationship in the spiritual sense with our spouses when we are in heaven. because it'll be a much more intimate relationship than could possibly be imagined, but it won't be a fleshly relationship.
Thank you, Father. I didn't mean to take too much time.
No problem. We were basically at a point where I was going to say we probably ought to stop, and we'll pick this back up at verse 19. We won't be able to do a session next week because we have a clergy retreat next week. So I'll be gone for 3 days, Monday through Wednesday. But we'll go ahead and have our next session on March the 16th, which is a Monday. We're doing it on a Monday because we already have a catechumen meeting scheduled on a Tuesday. So let's go ahead and say the closing prayer. It is truly meet to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless and mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth through God the Word. The very Theotokos thee do we magnify. Good night, everybody.
Good night,
Night,
Father.
Father.
Thank you.
Good night, Father. Good night, everyone.
Right. Thank you.